Hello, everyone. My name is Sumit Verlekar. I'm the founder of Tilden Global Education. We are a admissions consulting firm based primarily out of Mumbai as well as San Francisco. I wanted to today invite a newly minted Wharton MBA admit, which is Ashmit. So, hi, Ashmit. Welcome.
Hi Sumit, how are you doing? So, a little bit about myself. I am Ashmit. I am based out of Gurgaon. I just graduated this year from IT Delhi in the electrical engineering department. And yeah, I have been fortunate enough to be part of Sumit's cohort and been able to crack the warden admit. So, yeah, excited to get started with this.
Yeah. So, I think the one big question that, a lot of people will always kind of look at is, why is an engineer moving towards an MBA, right? So could you maybe talk a bit about that sort of journey as to how you first of all determined that, hey, you know what, I don't want to go down the technical route. I want more interested in the business side of things. And then specifically, once you had that feeling that you wanted to be like, why did MBA and specifically the deferred process come to mind?
Sure. So, when I joined college, I wasn't really sure of how I wanted to or what I wanted my career to necessarily look like, which is why I tried to keep my options open by joining like a branch like joining a circuital branch in the form of electrical engineering, so that I can go down the tech pathway as well as the business pathway. Then, at the same time, I was always interested. I had my mind peaked with, how companies operate or how in general businesses can grow revenue and things like that. And which is why I started with a couple of business internships early in my second year. And basis that I just kept building on that across my tenure in college. I enjoyed, I was interested in the sustainability domain, and all of my internships sort of built upon each other. And I kept on discovering new and more things, and basis all of those experiences, then I developed this idea or this mindset to launch my own venture in the material circularity domain. And for accelerating that goal, then MBA felt like one of the best options, in terms of filling some of the knowledge gaps that I would
Mhm.
have in terms of launching my venture, and then B, obviously, meeting and being able to be a part of this cohort of exceptionally wonderful people who would not only be great connections but would also help me develop or help me fill some of the knowledge gaps that I earlier talked about, learning from operators, learning from people across geographies with different experiences. And once I had that mindset clear that I want to build this venture and this MBA is going to help me sort of achieve that goal, then the deferred MBA sort of seemed like a good pathway in my final year, because it allowed me to take more risks in the early stage of my career, rather than having to follow the more conventional path, following the more lucrative, consulting, private equity, that kind of path. It allowed me to accelerate my journey towards my goal, which is why I then endeavored to join the deferred cohort.
Lovely, right? So now, for example, you're at that stage, just when somebody like you says, all right, MBA is where I want to go, right? So could you tell the audience or could you share with the audience the baby steps, the specific things you did, like in terms of who you spoke with and, how did you sort of decide to sort of move ahead and what was that path?
Sure. So, in terms of number one, when it came to deciding about the MBA, I think this was a more gradual, long process, which came about through one, I talked about my experiences, but secondly, again, a lot of conversations with seniors from my own college. So I was part of the debating club. People within that club were, some of them were involved, or were walking down this path of the MBA, or were walking down this part of, transitioning to a business career, even from a technical institute. So I
Nice.
talked to some of those guys. I talked to a few of my seniors within some of the internships that I had done, if people who had done those same internships. And then uh with all of that, through all of those conversations, through my own experiences, I came arrived at this goal of doing the MBA. And then again, a similar process for the deferred admit. I talked to some of the people who had walked down this road, who had themselves applied through Tilden itself, and they spoke very quite highly of you, which is what sort of also uh, motivated me, or sort of put me over the bridge that, hey, look, someone who was in the same shoes as me, let's say a couple of years ago, went down this road with Sumit, and it worked out quite well for them. And
Yeah.
so I was sort of the opinion that this is something that I can also achieve, which is when then I decided to sort of enroll with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that typically for many a times, I just did want to call out something about Ashmit, and that's something that I've always admired. That is, once he decides, he's very sure about what he's going to do, and many a times when people join our cohort, it's often preceded by, like, some discussions with me or other members of my team. But in case of Ashmit, he's like, I think he just reached out to my team directly saying that, hey, send me what you have to send. And then, like, before I knew it, suddenly he had joined. Like, there was no discussion, nothing. So that also kind of says something about him, which I think comes from sort of the research that he had put in. And he was very clear about making that decision. Also, one thing to sort of call out right here is that he did not have a GMAT score when he had joined, which is also true for about a good 80-85% of people, right? So I think a lot of people make the mistake of waiting for the GMAT score sometimes, which can take away from the time that you spend in the more fundamental things in the process, which we will come to now, right?
Yeah.
So when after you joined, Ashmit, uh, could you kind of broadly talk about your experience and what that sort of the next few months looked like
Hmm.
before you started your application?
Right. So as Sumit mentioned, so I'll start with this one seminar you guys held in our college, wherein you had previous admits through the deferred MBA cohort, again across different institutes, who had participated with you. And I connected with them after the seminar as well. Obviously was there in the seminar, but yeah, after the seminar as well, which is sort of what helped me be sure of my decision that, hey, this is the path that I want to follow. And I had also sort of learned a little bit about what the process looks like, again through conversations with them. And so I had, and one thing that sort of stood out or was sort of top of mind amongst everyone who had communicated, who were rather part of this seminar, was that it is quite beneficial to start early, because that helps you sort of get your foundation in place before you sort of segue into the actual application portion, because across applications, again, in my experience, most of what the schools are looking for is, number one, are you intentional about your pursuits in college? Number two, how do those pursuits add up into your long-term career goal? And number three, how does MBA fit into that picture? And how do you essentially use the MBA to then springboard yourself towards your long-term goal? And so, having that clear foundation, clear story in place was what took up the first few months of my engagement with Samir, in the sense that for the application period starts around late December, early January. Before that, I had joined around in August. So up until December, we were just finalizing what my overall foundation, what my overall story would look like. And then because of that, it was relatively quite simpler to then use that for the essays then, because across different schools, the underlying themes are what I just talked about, which we sort of finalize in the earlier portions, and then we tweak those things a little bit here and there to then apply those to the schools. And then from late December, early January, we were then constantly reiterating on or iterating again and again on our essays, using the initial foundation that we had come up with. So that was what the overall process looked like. And specifically, there were a lot of information sessions, a lot of webinars that Sumit regularly hosted throughout the entire process, that sort of were insights into or gave insights into how do you craft an essay specific to this school, or what is this specific school looking for. There were detailed application documents containing, again, specific things that, oh, let's say if you're applying for Stanford, you should probably write in this fashion, or this is what they would appreciate more. Or probably for a Wharton, they would probably look at your application in through this lens. So that sort of those specific insights sort of enabled me to translate that foundation into a well crafted essay for each school then.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think Ashmit, you've covered that really comprehensively. I think the key thing is that you just need to give it a bit more time. I'll just reiterate and call that out again. Primarily because, for example, in Ashmit's case, right, stories are of all different types. Some stories are very intuitive, it just kind of jumps out from the resume. Sometimes stories are a bit more complex, right? And in Ashmit's case, the story was very powerful, but it was also very complex. So a lot of the effort that he and I took really were to make sure that it was simplified so that it would be intuitive for the person who's reading it, the admissions committee, to understand that. And that I think is one of the most sort of underrated elements of the entire process, right? And Ashmit obviously can testify to that as to how much pains both of us took, right, to make sure that it got there. We kept on giving him feedback, and I'm sure that at some point in time he would have probably been a bit frustrated, saying that why the heck is it taking so much time for me, whereas other people has probably started after me and then they moved on. But that's the thing, right? Because we've kind of done it so much for both, not just the deferred process, but also for the full-time MBA process. When you're applying to a school like a Stanford or a Harvard or like a Wharton, you really, really can't leave anything to chance, and you really need to cross all T's and dot all I's to make sure that yes, now we are 100% confident and clear that yes, this is something that's going to attract lots of different schools, right, for XYZ reasons. So I'm glad that we went through the process, and obviously today he stands with not just Wharton, but he's also got two or three other M7 admits, right? So this is an incredible performance, from the application, or a takeaway that he's got from the application. So great. Now, specifically regarding the process itself, right? Once you started the process, could you maybe just, maybe in a minute, talk about what did the process look like? Uh, don't repeat if you think you don't want to, like what you have already mentioned, but specifically, any specific challenges you encountered while, going through the process and how you overcame it. Also, any kind of highlights or high points that you want to talk about.
Hmm. I think so. From an overall timeline lens, I think I've covered sufficiently as to what the entire process looks like. From a
Yeah.
more from a more granular perspective, it's just you crafting your story pitch, sending it to your mentor, and then them helping you out with feedback. You try to integrate that and draft a new version, and then this keeps going on until essentially uh essentially you are able to come up with a perfect version as Sumit just mentioned. But I think from a challenge standpoint, I think the biggest thing that or the biggest challenge that I faced was, I think drafting my first essay, because that is really the time that you have to, translate your entire foundation into an actual essay for a school, and again integrate some of the specific school specific insights that again Sumit will tell you about when you are essentially starting a new school. And because you don't really have a lot of experience prior to that, writing an essay like this, it's actually quite difficult, and it takes quite some time to, finish your first school essay. And then I think once a couple of schools are done, then you are sort of in a good place in terms of, reapplying or tweaking that format again and again across different schools. And so the latter part of the process then becomes slightly more streamlined, because you are in a better mental place as to what is the feedback trying to uh, point you towards, and how can you sort of integrate that within your specific essays.
Right. Great. I think that's basically it. And then, of course, the interview is a very different sort of experience in itself. So once you apply, you submit your applications, you receive the interview calls. Of course, Ashmit received a fair few as well. So, Ashmit, do you want to talk about sort of your interview experiences, and specifically, not giving out specific strategies maybe, but just kind of, what sort of, were they along expected lines, and how did you prepare and stuff like that?
Yeah. So yeah, I got 4 out of 7 M7 interview calls, and I think that was speaks volumes about the quality of the essays that we were together able to craft, because there are a lot of people with really great profiles, but unless they're able to communicate themselves or put their stories forward in a highly compelling way, it won't interest the adcom, as Sumit talked about. And yeah, I think from essentially the interview preparation process is again highly guided and highly helped by with Sumit as well. So essentially, when you get in, when I got my first interview call, I informed him, and again, like the essays, he has school specific interview resources for each school as well. So there is this webinar, there is this information session that he holds for each school, and at the same time, you get a set of a comprehensive list of almost like all possible questions that the school has that school has asked for in the last like 3 4 5 years. And so, and you have then a couple of mocks that you do with people of the team, which essentially together, the list of questions, the specific insights from the webinar and the mocks, they prepare you quite well in terms of knowing what to expect in a typical interview. Obviously there can be surprises here and there can be like a couple of new questions that they might ask each year, or something that you would not be prepared for, but largely it goes along the lines that you expected, which is why you are in a more relaxed, mentally sorted place while you're sitting in the interview, because you're not taken aback every question, or how do I come up with an answer, because of all the in-depth preparation that you do beforehand. So yeah, I think having those mocks, I think the highlight for me that stood out, that okay, you can come up with those questions, but actually having them tested, how you're communicating those answers and getting feedback on those was, I think, that's something really something that stood out for me really.
I'm glad you found it useful, of
Yeah.
course. So if you were to like just, I think we are kind of at the end of the interview. So thank you so
Mhm.
much for sharing the entire thing. But is there any advice you would provide to future applicants, or is there anything else that we may not have covered so far that you want to maybe convey?
Sure. I think couple of things. So number one would be to, I think, during college itself, if in I think the first thing should be, you need to be sort of intentional about each of your pursuit. uh and I think this translates to your basic foundation then, in the sense that if you're communicating or pitching or communicating a story that's sort of it's very easy for someone to understand, it's easy for someone to relate to from the experiences that you speak about also. That's, I think, what makes a compelling pitch, and that's, I think, what makes a compelling application for the adcoms at the end of the day. So I think when it comes to people who are in their second year, third year, first year, who might essentially have an interest of pursuing an MBA from, let's say, one of these M7 schools, I think just being dedicated or being targeted towards specific actions and being driven towards them is, I think, something I would advise. From a fourth year of a final year standpoint, maybe if you are, let's say, looking to apply this year, then I think the only piece of advice would be to start early and do your research well, in terms of speak to a lot of people, speak to alums of your own school, reach out to people on LinkedIn, talk about their experiences, so that you can understand if the MBA is right for you, which school is are the ones that you should target, what school would probably appreciate your profile more. And I think that can only be found out through these primary conversations. There is only X amount of research that you can do through the college's website, because all of those seem very lucrative, very, very like appealing to an individual applicant. But yeah, when you speak to people there, you actually understand if this is going to be a good fit for you, if the MBA program in general is important or is going to be a good fit for you. And then once you're clear on that, then I think you should just start early, and enroll with like an admissions consultant, like Tilden probably, uh, who essentially help you through the entire process, because doing it alone is actually quite intimidating, quite daunting, and you would not get some of the feedback that like Sumit gives you. Because I remember my final version of my essays and my first versions were starkly different. And so I think that's sort of what helped me get through this process also in a beneficial way.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And I'm deeply appreciative about what you mentioned. So Ashwin, thank you so much. And thanks. I'm sure that a lot of you guys who are watching this video are going to find it incredibly valuable. I would encourage you to just go through this video, specific parts of it. We're going to be putting in timestamps So you can just go through those parts again and again, because Ashmit is one of the persons who's actually gone through the process and emerged out of it extremely successful. And I'm sure that all his experience, will be of hopefully benefit to you as well. So obviously, you feel free to reach out to him. I'm sure he'll be a great mentor himself, for those of you who are looking to pursue this. But at the same time, you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll also be asking my team to put in the contact email for our team, which is connect@tilden.in. So you can reach out to them and just kind of ask them about the next steps, and I'm sure that they will guide you as well. But thank you, Ashmit, again for being here. This has been incredibly valuable, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much, Sumit. And yeah, thank you for helping through the entire process. And yeah, take care. Bye bye.